Welcome to my presentation on the piping plover, an endangered shorebird found in the Great Lakes region and other parts of North America. In this presentation, I'll discuss its taxonomy, range, habitat, threats, adaptations, and conservation efforts. The piping plover is a small pale-colored shorebird that blends into sandy beaches. It is listed as endangered in the Great Lakes population and threatened in other regions. Its presence indicates healthy coastal ecosystems, and it plays a key role in the food web. The piping plover belongs to the genus Charadrius and has two recognized subspecies, Charadrius melodus melodus and Charadrius melodus circumcinctus. Understanding taxonomy helps in conservation by clarifying population differences. And you can also see on the slide, I also listed other information on the taxonomy, the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then the species and subspecies that I discussed. So this kind of gives you an idea of what kind of species this is and in what categories it falls in. The piping plover is a really good example of a bird with limited adaptability. Unlike some animals that have many subspecies or close relatives that live in lots of different environments, the piping plover only has two main subspecies, the Atlantic Coast group and the Great Lakes or Great Plains group. That's it. No other direct children beyond these. Why does this matter? Well, in biology, having more than one subspecies or evolutionary branches often gives a species more options for survival. It's kind of like having backup plans. The piping plover doesn't really have those backup options, which tells us that it's more specialized and tied to its very specific habitats like sandy beaches and dunes. This connects to what we've been learning about the population biology. A species with less variety has a harder time adapting if the environment suddenly changes, like rising water levels, predators, or human activity on beaches. That means their survival depends a lot more on us, humans, protecting their habitat and making sure their population doesn't get too small. The piping plover's range stretches across the Atlantic coast, the Great Lakes, and the northern Great Plains. In the US alone, it's found in more than 20 states, and it also extends into parts of Canada. So it covers a pretty big geographic area overall. The important detail is that its habitat isn't one big connected space. Instead, it's broken up into small patches of sandy beaches and shorelines. And you can see on the screen, I provided a good map of the US and Canada, and you can kind of see the different parts that the bird occupies, and it's also color-coded to be able to see more easy. This is where island biogeography comes in. Even though the piping plover lives on the mainland, its populations are kind of like living on islands. Each little stretch of beach is isolated from the others, just like the islands on the ocean. According to the island biogeography, smaller and more isolated patches of habitat usually support fewer individuals and have a higher risk of local extinction. That means if one beach gets washed up by a storm or developed by humans, that local group of plovers might disappear. So even though the species range across many states, its survival really depends on protecting these small scattered habitats that act like islands for its population. Let's take a closer look at the piping plover's habitat. In the Great Lakes region and across other parts of its range, this bird relies heavily on wide sandy shorelines and open dunes. These areas usually have very little vegetation, which is important because plovers need clear sight lines to detect predators. When it comes to nesting, they choose drier, higher ground and create simple scrapes in the sand, often placing them near small pebbles and shells. This natural camouflage helps them blend the eggs into the landscape, making them harder for predators to spot. It is very good thinking. You can totally see in the picture, the plover right there is very blended in, and you can see in all the pictures in this presentation, I tried to show just how camouflaged this bird really gets. It's very hard to see unless you, like when you're taking a picture of it to zoom it in all the way, it's really hard to see this bird from far away. The piping plover's survival is tightly linked to the availability of these unique coastal habitats, which is why even small changes to beaches and dunes can have a big impact on their populations. The piping plover's diet is pretty simple, but very specific to its shoreline habitat. These birds feed mostly on small insects, crustaceans, and marine worms that they find along sandy beaches and wetland edges. They're ground foragers, which means they walk or run along the shoreline, pecking at the small sand or mud to pick up food. This behavior is well adapted to their environment because their light coloring helps them blend in, making it easier to search for food without attracting predators. The variety of food they eat shows how dependent they are on the healthy shoreline ecosystem. If one food source declines, like insects due to pesticides or crustaceans because of water pollution, they can shift a little. But they don't have endless options. Their survival depends on these small but important organisms being available. This highlights how even the smallest changes in shoreline ecosystems can ripple up to affect larger species like the piping plover. The piping plover's food sources are small invertebrates like insects, crustaceans, and marine worms that live along the shorelines. Unfortunately, these food sources are being threatened by human activity and environmental changes. One major issue is coastal development. When beaches are turned into housing, resorts, and other infrastructure, the natural shoreline ecosystems that support plover food collapse. Population also plays a huge role, since runoff from cities and farms can contaminate the water and reduce the number of insects and aquatic invertebrates available. Lastly, climate change is causing rising water levels and more frequent storms, which erode beaches and make it harder for food sources to stay stable. All of these factors together reduce the amount of food available to plovers, making it more difficult for them to survive, reproduce, and recover as a species. This is a great example of how human actions directly impact not just the habitat, but also the survival of a species' basic needs, just like food. Their nesting strategy has challenges too. These birds lay eggs directly on the sand, so they're vulnerable to predators, flooding, and abandonment. In fact, research from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has found the nest failure in the Great Lakes is often caused by adult disappearance, usually due to predators' attacks, especially from merlins, followed by the clutch abandonment and flooding events. One study noted a significant increase in merlin predation, leading to adult mortality and nest failure. On top of that, human disturbances play a big role too. Things like ATV tracks, footprints near nests, or damaged protective fencing, even events like fireworks on beaches, all have contributed to nest loss. The piping plover shows us how adaptation works in real time. Adaptations are traits that help a species survive in its environment. For plovers, one key adaptation is their sand-colored plumage, which helps camouflage them against beaches and dunes. This reduces predation risk from foxes, gulls, and other animals. Over time, natural selection may continue to favor birds with stronger camouflage, better foraging efficiency, or better responses to human disturbance. Because their habitat is limited, plovers may also adapt by shifting slightly to new nesting areas such as artificial beaches or restored shorelines. These adaptations highlight how even small changes in the community, like vegetation growth or predator presence, can shape the traits that are passed on to future generations. Natural selection is tightly connected to habitat and niche. The piping plover occupies a very narrow niche, open, sandy, and sparsely vegetated beaches near water. This makes them vulnerable because any loss of habitat directly affects survival. Selective pressures in their habitat include predation, storms, and human recreation. For example, plovers that are more cautious or nest in slightly less disturbed areas may be more successful in raising chicks. Over many generations, this could shift the population towards the traits that improve survival in disturbed environments. However, their specialized niche also makes them less flexible compared to generalist species. This is a classic example from our readings. When a population has a narrow niche, it is more at risk under environmental change, but also shows clear evolutionary response to selective pressures. The piping plover's population growth is naturally limited, and that makes recovery a slow process. For each breeding pair usually lays only 3 to 4 eggs per season, and many nests fail because of flooding, predators, or people disturbing the beaches. That means the population doesn't grow quickly, even under good conditions. From our week 3 readings, we know population with low reproductive rates are more vulnerable to extinction when they face new pressures. This is especially true for the Great Lakes population, which functions almost like an island population, isolated, small, and more at risk of collapse if numbers drop. Carrying capacity is the maximum number of plovers that the environment can support and is shaped by habitat size, food availability, and threats. For plovers, carrying capacity is directly reduced by human development, beach use, and climate impacts like storm surges that wash away nests. Conservation programs try to raise carrying capacity by protecting nest sites, fencing off breeding areas, and managing predators. The challenge is that if beaches keep shrinking, the carrying capacity will remain low, limited population growth. This combination of low reproductive output and reduced carrying capacity explains why the piping plover has struggled to recover for decades. It also shows how ecological concepts like population growth and carrying capacity aren't just theoretical. They explain real-world challenges for endangered species. When we think about how the piping plover might continue to evolve, we have to look at the ecological community it lives in. For example, predator-prey dynamics play a huge role. Plovers nest directly on the ground, which makes their eggs and chicks easy targets for predators like foxes, raccoons, gulls, and even domestic pets. Over time, this pressure has favored adaptations such as their sandy-colored camouflage, which helps them and their nest blend in with the beach environment. Competition is another influence. Plovers don't just share beaches with predators, they also compete with other shorebirds for nesting sites and food. If larger, more aggressive birds take the best spots, plovers are forced into smaller or less suitable areas. This affects their survival and reproduction. Using concepts from this week's reading, we can see that both predation and competition acts as a selective pressure that shapes plover behavior, nesting strategies, and even long-term survival. These interactions drive natural selection in action. Because the piping plover is listed as endangered in the Great Lakes and threatened elsewhere, conservation has been a huge focus. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has developed detailed recovery plans that include protecting breeding habitats, monitoring populations, and working with local communities. One key strategy is putting up symbolic fencing and signs around nesting areas during the breeding season. This keeps people from accidentally disturbing nests. Habitat protection is also critical. Agencies work to restore beaches and limit harmful activities like off-road vehicle use. Predator management, such as controlling gulls or raccoons near nesting sites, is another tool. Finally, public education and campaigns make a big difference. People who live or vacation near plover nesting areas are taught how to share the beach responsibly. This shows that conservation isn't only about scientists. It also depends on community involvement to make recovery successful. To wrap up, we've covered a lot about the piping plover. We started with its taxonomy, learning about its place in the bird family tree and its current listing status as endangered or threatened. Then we explored its range, which includes the Atlantic coast, Great Plains, and Great Lakes, and how island biogeography concepts explain why some populations are more vulnerable than others. We also looked at its life history, its habitats, diet, and nesting behaviors, as well as the many threats it faced from predators to human disturbances to climate change. Along the way, we connected these ideas to concepts like adaptation, natural selection, population growth, and carrying capacity. Finally, we've discussed conservation efforts showing that recovery plans not just on science, but also on people protecting and respecting habitats. The piping plover is a great example of how ecology, evolution, and conservation all connect, and why protecting these small species is important for maintaining biodiversity. So on this last slide, I've included the references I used throughout the presentation. All the information I shared comes from reliable sources like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Environment and Climate Change Canada, which provide the most up-to-date data on endangered species like the piping plover. I also included a peer-reviewed journal article that gives historical context about the bird's distribution and ecology. These references are important because they are not only support the accuracy of the information, but they also show how different organizations and researchers work together to track, protect, and study these species. If you'd like to learn more about the piping plover and conservation species, these sources are a great starting point. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch my presentation and learn about the piping plover, which is a very beautiful bird. I enjoyed doing the research on this species. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.